In this video, you're going to add a form field to your index.html file. This is going to render an input field and a button to the screen, and a user is going to be able to interact with that, as opposed to having to call socket.emit from the developer tools, which is not a sustainable option for real users. This only works for us developers. Now, in order to get started, we're going to be editing index.html. Then we're going to move into index.js. We're going to add a listener that's going to wait for the form to be submitted. And inside of that listener callback, we are going to fire socket.emit with the data typed in the field. We're also going to take a moment to render all incoming messages to the screen. At the end of this video, we'll have an ugly yet working chat application. Now, before we do any of that, we are going to be using a library called jQuery to do DOM manipulation, which means that we want to be able to do stuff with our rendered HTML, but we want to be able to do that from our JavaScript file. We're going to use jQuery to make that a lot easier in terms of cross-browser compatibility. To grab this library, we're going to head over to Google Chrome, go to jQuery.com, and you can grab the most recent version. The version's not going to matter for here. We're using very basic features available in all versions. I'm grabbing the most recent version, 3.1.0. Then I'm going to go ahead and download the compressed production version by right-clicking and opening it in a new tab. Here we have the actual JavaScript that we want to load in to our application, which means we can right-click some sort of empty area, click Save As, and go into our projects folder. Desktop, Node Chat App, Public, JS, and inside of JS, I'm going to create a new directory called libs where we'll store third-party JavaScript. We're going to be working with a few more client-side JavaScript libraries throughout the section, so it's nice to create a folder to stay organized. I'm going to save that in there, close the tab as well as the downloads area, and now we can go ahead and load it into index.html and add our form. Down here, just between socket.io and index.js, we're going to add a new script tag to load in jQuery. We got to specify that source attribute with the path to the file, /js/libs, followed by a / and the file name. jQuery -3.1.0.min.js. Awesome. And now let's go ahead and set up our form tag. This is going to render our form fields to the browser. If you're not familiar with these tags, that is perfectly fine. Simply follow along and I'll explain as we go. First up, we need a form tag. This creates a form that's submittable by the user. This is exactly what we're going to use to submit our messages. And on this form tag, we're going to add one attribute. It's the ID attribute, which lets us give this element a unique identifier, making it really easy to target with our JavaScript a bit later on. Remember, we're going to want to add a listener to this element when the form gets submitted. We're going to want to do something in our JavaScript file. Notably, what we're going to want to do is call socket.emit. I'm going to set ID equal to, inside of quotes, message-form. Now that we have our form tag complete, we can add some tags inside of it. To get started, we're going to add a button, which is going to appear at the bottom of the form. This button, on click, is going to submit the form. I'm opening and closing my tag, and just inside, I can type whatever text I want to appear on the button. I'm going to go with send. Now that we have our button in place, the only thing we need to do is add the little text field. This is going to be the text field where a user types their message. This is going to require us to use an input tag, and instead of opening and closing an input tag like this, we're going to use the self-closing syntax because we don't need to actually put anything inside of it like we do for button here or like we do for form here. We are going to be adding quite a few attributes onto input. First up, name. We want to give this field a unique name. Something like message is going to get the job done. We also want to go ahead and set the type. There's a lot of different types for input tags. Types could include something like a checkbox, or in our case, the type we're going to use inside of quotes is text. The last attribute we're going to add to input is called placeholder. We're going to set this value equal to, inside of quotes, a string. This string is going to get rendered in the field in a light gray before the user actually enters a value. I'm going to tell the user that this is where their message goes. With this in place, we can actually test out our form's rendering by starting up the server using nodemon server /server.js and going to localhost 3000. The server is up. I'm going to visit Google Chrome, go to localhost 3000, and you'll notice something kind of cool. I haven't actually visited the URL yet, but you can see that the connection has already occurred. Chrome does some lazy loading. If it thinks you're going to go to a URL, it's actually going to make the request. So when I do visit it, it loads even faster. Now, if I visit localhost 3000, what do we get? We get our little form. We can type in a message like test, and we can send it off. Now, by default, forms are very old school. If I try to submit this form, it's actually going to go through a full page refresh. Then it's going to add the data, like our message text, as a query string on the URL. This is not what we want to do. We want to run some custom JavaScript on form submit. So we're going to attach a custom event listener and override the default behavior. To get that done, we are going to have to use jQuery, and we're going to need to select this form field. Before we dive into index.js, let's take a quick moment to talk about how we can use jQuery to select elements. jQuery, which is accessible via the jQuery variable with an uppercase Q, takes as its argument your selector. Right here, we're going to add a string, and we can select our elements. For example, if we want to select all the paragraph tags on the screen, we would type P in here. These are really similar to CSS selectors if you're familiar with them, and right here we've selected our paragraph tag. I could also go ahead and select all of the divs inside of my program, or I could select elements by ID or class, and that's what we're going to do. In order to select an element by ID, we first start with the pound sign, and then we type the name. In our case, we have a form called message-form, and if I fire this off, we do indeed get that back. This is going to allow us to add an event listener. Over inside of index.js, we're going to add that exact same selector near the bottom. jQuery, calling it with our selector, pound sign, message-form, and now we're going to add an event listener, and the event listener is going to look pretty similar to our socket.io event listeners. We are going to be calling on, and we are going to be providing those two arguments, the event name, inside of quotes, submit, and a function. This function is going to fire when a user tries to submit the form. Now, unlike our socket.io event listeners, we are going to get one argument right here, a event argument, and we are going to need to access this. We're going to need to access this event argument in order to override that default behavior that causes that page refresh. Right here, we're going to call e.prevent_default. Prevent default prevents the default behavior for the event, and by default, a submit event goes through that page refresh process. We can go ahead and test that everything is working by going into Google Chrome, giving the page a refresh. I'm also going to remove the query string from the URL. Now we can type in some sort of message like test, hit send, and you can see that nothing happens. Nothing happens because we overrode the default behavior. All we need to do to make something happen is call socket.emit. We're going to emit the create message event right here, create message, and we're going to go ahead and provide our data. Now the name from field for now is just going to be user in uppercase. We're going to leave this as anonymous for the moment, although we will be updating that a bit later in the section. Now the text field, this is going to come from the form. We're going to want to add a selector, and we're going to want to get the value back. Let's go ahead and do that using jQuery. We're going to call jQuery once again, and we're going to select this input right here. We can go ahead and select it by its name, name equals message. In order to get that done, we're going to open up brackets like this, setting name equal to message. And this is going to select any element that has a name attribute equal to message, which is just R1, and we can go ahead and get its value using the .val method. No semicolon required since we're inside of object creation. With this in place, we can now go ahead and add our callback function for our acknowledgement. For the moment, it doesn't really do anything, but that's perfectly fine. We have to add it in order to fulfill the acknowledgement setup we currently have in place. And now that we have our event listener set up, let's go ahead and test this out. I'm going to head back into Chrome, give the page a refresh, type in some message like this should work. And when we submit the form, we should see it show up over here as a new message. I'm going to send it off, and you can see that right inside of the terminal, we have a user sending this should work, and it also shows up right here. The same thing is true if I open up a second connection. I'm going to open up the developer tools so we can see exactly what's happening behind the scenes. I'm going to type some message like from tab 2, send it off, and we should see it over in tab 1, and we do. Perfect. Everything is working as expected. Now, obviously, this setup's not complete. We want to wipe that form value after we send the message, and we want to take care of a few other UI-related things, but for now, it is working pretty well. With a basic form in place, the second thing we're going to do is render incoming messages to the screen. Now, once again, it is going to look pretty ugly, but it will get the job done. To get this done, we have to create a place inside of our DOM, inside of our index.html file, where we can render the messages. Once again, we're going to give this element an ID that we can easily access over inside of index.js so we can render those messages. First up, what we're going to do is create an ordered list by creating an OL tag just like this. This list is going to let us add items to it, and those items are going to be the individual messages. Now we are going to be giving this an ID attribute. I'm going to call the ID, in this case, messages. Awesome. Now this is all we need to do in index.html. All of the heavy lifting is going to happen over inside of index.js. When a new message comes in, we want to add something inside of the ordered list so that gets rendered to the screen. Over inside of index.js, we can get this done by modifying our callback function when a new message arrives. The first thing we're going to do is create a list item. And we're going to do this once again using jQuery. We're going to make a variable. This variable is going to be called li, and we're going to go ahead and use jQuery slightly differently. Rather than using jQuery to select an element, we're going to use jQuery to create an element, and then we can modify that element and add it into the markup, making it visible. Right here, inside of quotes, we're going to open and close an li tag just like we would inside of index.html. Now that we have this in place, we have to go ahead and set its text property. I'm going to set li.text by calling li.text with the value I want to use. In this case, the text is going to require us to set up a little template string. Inside of the template string, we are going to go ahead and use the data that comes back. For now, we're going to use the from attribute and the text attribute. Let's get started with who it's from. Then we'll add a little colon and a space to separate that from the actual message. And finally, we'll inject message.text at the end. Now at this point, we've created an element, but we haven't rendered it to the DOM. What we're going to do is use jQuery to select that brand new element we created. We gave it an ID of messages, and we're going to append something to it by calling the append method. This is going to add it as its last child. So if there's already 3 items in the list, the newest one will show up below those 3 as the 4th item in our ordered list. All we have to do is call append as a function, passing in our list item. And with this in place, we are done. Now, if you're not familiar with jQuery, this can be a bit overwhelming, but I promise the techniques we use here we'll be using throughout the course. By the end, you'll be much more comfortable selecting and creating elements. Let's go ahead and test things out over inside of Google Chrome. I'm going to refresh tab 1, and when I do, you can see from is not defined over in the right-hand side. If I go back into Atom, this is most likely just a really small typo, and you can see that is the case. Message.from is defined, which means I can save the file and give things a refresh. Simple errors like this can easily be tracked down using the developer tools. They actually give you some pretty great error information as well as an entire call stack. On the right-hand side, you can usually click this little link. This is going to bring you to the Sources tab, and it's going to show you exactly where the error occurred. Here you can see not only the line the error occurred, but the actual indentation into the line. The error occurred right here. This is really fantastic. It makes debugging much easier. If you run into an error inside of the console, you can usually get more information by either expanding it or going right to the source of the problem. Now that we've fixed that error and we give the app a refresh, we do see our 2 messages. Welcome to the chat app shows up and Frank says hi. Now, welcome to the chat app should show up. The Frank hi message is coming from right here inside of index.js. We can actually go ahead and remove that. We no longer need to automatically emit messages since we have a form set up to get that done for us. Once again, we can save the file, refresh the browser, and this time around, we have a nice little setup. Welcome to the chat app. I'm going to do the same thing for our second tab. This time around, we get welcome to the chat app, and in the first tab, we get new user joined. This is fantastic. Now, the true test is going to be to send a message from one tab to the other. This should go to tab 2. I'm going to send this off, and when I click this button, it's going to emit the event that's going to go to the server, and the server is going to send it to everyone connected. Right here, I can see this should go to tab 2, renders, and over inside of my second tab, we get the message as well. I can come here and respond. And when I respond, it shows up in both tabs. Now, we're not quite done with the UI or the actual user experience. Custom names and timestamps are coming up, but we do have a fantastic start. We now have a form where we can submit messages, and we can see all of the incoming messages inside of the browser, which means we do not need to do anything in the developer tools anymore in terms of emitting or reading our messages. That is it for this one. Let's go ahead and wrap things up by making a commit now that we have some working changes. I'm going to shut down the server, clear the output, and run git status so we can double check all of our changes. Everything looks good here. I'm going to use git add to add all of the files, including my untracked jQuery file, to the repo. Then I can use git commit to make the commit. I'm going to use the M flag here, and a good message for this one would be add form for messages and show incoming messages in browser. Once we have this in place, we can go ahead and push this up to GitHub, and I am going to take a moment to deploy to Heroku now that we have something real visible and tangible to use. Git push, Heroku master is going to get that done. Once this is up, we'll be able to visit it in the browser. As you can see over inside of my console, Socket.io is trying to reconnect to the server. Unfortunately, we're not going to be bringing it back up, so it's going to try a little longer. Here we are, we're verifying the deploy, and everything is up and running. You can either run Heroku open or copy this URL directly. I'm going to go ahead and close my 2 localhost tabs and open up the actual Heroku app. Right here, we do get our welcome to the chat app message, and we do get our form. Everything looks good so far. I'm going to go ahead and open up a different browser like Safari. I'm going to go to the chat app as well. And we're going to bring these windows side by side. Over inside of Safari, I'm going to type a little message. This is live on Heroku. Click send or hit the enter key, and instantly it shows up in the other browser, in the other tab. This is because our live socket server is transmitting this data. This could happen between any computer in the world. You do not need to be on my machine since we're using a real Heroku URL. Now that everything's working on Heroku, we are done. I will see you next time.